It started with something as simple as a smile, one that lingered just a fraction longer than usual. A smile that promised more than just politeness. It held an invitation, a dare, and I couldn't resist. At first, it was easy to dismiss as nothing more than professional courtesy. But I knew better. I wasn't a fool, and I wasn't blind. The way Mr. Harris looked at me, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long, was enough to make me wonder if there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. Let me introduce myself. I'm Carla. I'm a wife, a mother, and I've worked in the marketing department of our company for the past 6 years. Married to Brian for 8 years now, we've built a life together. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. He was a kind, hard-working man. We had our ups and downs like any marriage, but we always found a way to work things out. Or at least, that's what I told myself every day when I looked in the mirror. But I wasn't happy. Or maybe it's better to say I wasn't fulfilled. Brian was a good man, there's no denying that, but something was missing. The spark we once had slowly dimmed, and I started to feel like I was just going through the motions. Our routine had become predictable, safe. But that wasn't enough for me. I didn't want a life of comfort. I wanted more. Then came Mr. Harris. He was tall, broad-shouldered, commanding. He had the kind of presence that made everyone around him stop and take notice. I didn't see him much at first. He was the type of boss who wasn't always in the trenches with his employees. But when he was, everyone respected him. His dark eyes were sharp, calculated, always observing. I had heard whispers about him. How he was a force in the company. How he built his empire from the ground up. They called him the boss in the office, and it was clear why. He was a man who exuded power without even trying. The first time I really saw him wasn't in a meeting or at a corporate event, but in passing on the way to the break room. He was standing by the elevators, his jacket slightly undone, his tie loosened. He looked so different from the clean-cut, polished version of him I was used to seeing. And when his eyes met mine, I swear I felt the air between us shift. For a moment, it felt like the whole world disappeared. The noise of the office faded into the background, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating faster. I remember feeling like I shouldn't be looking at him the way I was, that I should turn away, walk off, pretend I hadn't noticed the chemistry sparking between us. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong. I didn't even know what it was exactly. It wasn't just his physical appearance, though he was undoubtedly handsome in a rugged, intimidating sort of way. It was his confidence. The power that radiated from him with every step he took. That's what caught me. That's what drew me in. I told myself it was harmless. Just a harmless attraction. He was my boss after all, and I had a husband waiting for me at home. I wasn't that kind of woman. I wouldn't be that woman. But the longer I worked with him, the more I found myself thinking about him. It wasn't just in the office either. He began showing up in my thoughts when I was alone, when I was with Brian, when I was lying awake at night. Something about Mr. Harris made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One evening, after a particularly grueling workday, I found myself alone in the conference room reviewing some last-minute reports. The office was mostly empty, save for a few stragglers. And there he was, standing at the doorway, watching me. He didn't say anything, just stood there, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed over his chest. There was an electricity in the air between us, a tension I could feel in every nerve of my body. He didn't come any closer, didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his gaze heavy, knowing. I felt the heat in my cheeks, the way my breath caught in my throat. Finally he spoke. "You're still here," he said, his voice low and steady. "Yeah," I managed to say, my voice almost a whisper. "Just finishing up." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "You work hard," he said. "I respect that." I felt a sudden rush of warmth, a flush of pride mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite name. I had always worked hard, but it was different coming from him. The way he looked at me made me feel like I was the only person in the room who mattered. His gaze flicked to the chair opposite me, then back to me. "Do you mind if I sit?" Could have said no. I should have said no. But I didn't. No, of course not, I said, my voice shaking slightly. He sat down across from me, the space between us feeling impossibly small. The silence stretched on for a few moments, but it wasn't awkward. It was loaded with something unspoken. I could feel it, a sense of danger, of something forbidden. You're a good worker, Carla, he said, his voice breaking the silence like a soft caress. But you're more than that. I can see it. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in his words that made my stomach flip. You're not like the others, he continued. There's something about you. Something intriguing. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the weight of his words and the intensity of his gaze. And in that moment, I knew I was in trouble. I didn't want to be, but I was. And I couldn't stop myself. The night ended as most nights do, with a polite nod and a hasty goodbye. But the feeling between us lingered long after I'd left the office. I thought about it on my drive home, my hands gripping the wheel, my thoughts tangled in the heat of that conversation. The next few days passed in a blur. Each time I saw Mr. Harris, it felt like something had shifted, like the space between us had collapsed. I couldn't explain it, but there was something different in the air now, something more dangerous. The question haunted me. What was I willing to risk for the kind of attention Mr. Harris gave me? But that was a question for another day. For now, I would continue on pretending like everything was fine. Pretending like I didn't feel a growing desire I couldn't seem to shake. And all the while Brian had no idea. He was still the man who kissed me goodbye every morning. Still the man I shared my life with. But deep down I knew things had changed. And I couldn't deny the pull of Mr. Harris any longer. You want to know what happens next, don't you? Like and subscribe for the next chapter of this wild ride. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. It didn't take long for the chemistry between Mr. Harris and me to move beyond glances and stolen moments. And honestly, I don't think either of us tried to stop it. There was something about the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. It wasn't just about the power he exuded or the way he carried himself. It was about how he looked at me, like he could see straight through my layers, like he knew all of my secrets. I had never felt so alive. Let me be clear. I'm not proud of what I'm about to share. I should have stopped it before it even started. I should have recognized the signs and walked away, but I didn't. The temptation was too powerful. The rush of excitement, the fear, the guilt, it all mixed together in a way that was almost intoxicating. Every time I saw him, it became harder to resist. It was just another late evening at the office. Everyone had gone home except for the two of us. I had stayed behind to finish some reports, though I knew full well that my real reason for being there was to see him again, to feel that magnetism pulling me toward him. I was sitting at my desk, flipping through documents, trying to look busy when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. He didn't knock, he never did. He just walked in as if he owned the place because, in a way, he did. Still working, huh? He said, his voice smooth like velvet. I looked up from my desk, my heart skipping a beat. He was standing there in his usual crisp suit, but something about the way he was looking at me made my breath catch in my throat. He didn't say anything more, just stood there, watching me with that unreadable expression on his face. Yeah, I said, trying to sound casual, but I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. Not him, not myself. Good, he said, stepping closer. You're dedicated. I admire that. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. I could feel the heat in my cheeks, the flush of embarrassment, or was it desire? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't look away from him. Every part of me was drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain, like some magnetic force beyond my control. He was standing just a few feet away now, too close. I could smell his cologne, a mixture of musk and cedar, and it sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about his presence that made the air around us feel thick, charged. Then he did something that made my pulse race. He reached out and touched my arm. It was a simple gesture, just his fingers brushing lightly against my skin, but it felt like electricity shooting through me. My body tensed at the contact, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I looked up at him, but his face was impassive, unreadable, like he was waiting for me to make the next move. "You're not really working, are you?" he asked, his voice low, a hint of amusement in his tone. I shook my head, unable to speak. What could I say? That I was here alone with him, hoping for something more than just idle conversation. I had been lying to myself, pretending that I wasn't enjoying this, pretending that I didn't want him. Then, without warning, he leaned in. The distance between us vanished in an instant, and his lips brushed against my ear as he whispered, "You deserve more than this. More than a desk full of papers and a husband who doesn't see you for who you really are." His words cut through me like a hot knife. It was true, wasn't it? I had spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect employee, the perfect mother. But in all that striving, I had forgotten what it was like to feel desired, to feel seen, to feel wanted. His hand slid down my arm, his touch deliberate now, more possessive. In that instant, I knew there was no turning back. I wasn't just a woman caught in a moment of weakness anymore. I was a woman who wanted him, a woman who needed him. Before I could stop myself, I stood up, our bodies now inches apart. My breath was coming fast, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the hunger in his eyes, mirrored in my own. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He moved closer, his hand finding the small of my back, pulling me toward him. Then, in one smooth motion, he kissed me. It was everything I had imagined and more. His lips were soft but demanding, his hands strong as they cupped my face, tilting my head to deepen the kiss. I didn't resist. Couldn't. I kissed him back with every ounce of longing I had buried deep inside of me. It was a kiss of release, of surrender, and the world around us disappeared. I could hear the sound of my heart hammering in my chest, louder than anything else in the room. The kiss broke, and for a moment we just stood there, staring at each other, both of us breathless. My body was trembling, caught in a mix of excitement and guilt, but I didn't care. All I could think about was him. "You want this," he said, his voice thick with desire. I nodded, my throat dry, unable to form words. I wanted this more than I had ever wanted anything before. I had never felt so alive, so powerful. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore. It was about the control he had over me, the way he made me feel like I was someone special, not just another wife, another employee. His fingers trailed down my neck, and I couldn't help but shiver at the sensation. He leaned in again, kissing me, but this time the kiss was harder, more urgent. His hand slid down to my waist, and I felt the heat of his body pressed against mine. He was like fire, and I was a moth drawn to him, unable to pull away. I knew I should stop. I knew this was wrong. But in that moment, all I could think about was the way his body felt against mine, the way he made me feel like I was finally living again. And then, as if reality had caught up with me, I heard the sound of the office door opening. My heart stopped. We both froze, our bodies still pressed against each other, but now the world had come rushing back in. I pulled away quickly, turning toward the door to find one of the cleaning staff standing there, looking awkwardly between us. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her eyes wide. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Mr. Harris straightened up immediately, his composure returning as quickly as it had been shattered. I tried to regain some sense of dignity, but the damage had already been done. "We're fine," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We were just wrapping up. Go ahead." The woman nodded and quickly left the room, leaving us alone again. But the moment had passed. The magic was gone. Reality was back, and so was the guilt. I turned to him, my eyes meeting his for a moment before I quickly looked away. "What have we just done?" "You should go," I whispered, my voice shaky. He didn't argue. Instead, he just nodded, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We'll pick this up tomorrow," he said, his words dripping with promise. As he left the room, I sat down at my desk, my hands trembling. I knew this was just the beginning. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. I had made my choice, but I was still unsure of the consequences. Would I lose everything, or would I gain something far more dangerous? Only time would tell. The days that followed felt like a dream, but one of those dreams that you're half aware of while you're still in it. Everything in my life had suddenly shifted, but no one seemed to notice. Not Brian. Not my coworkers. Not even me. At least not until I was alone in the quiet of the night, lying next to him, pretending that I was just another wife. But I wasn't just another wife anymore. Mr. Harris and I had crossed a line, one I knew I'd never be able to uncross. The kiss in the office was just the beginning, but I couldn't get him out of my head. Every moment that I wasn't at work, I was thinking about him, about the way his hands had felt on me, the way his lips had tasted. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind, and I didn't want to. The worst part. I was enjoying every second of it. I told myself I'd take a step back. Focus on work. I'd go home to Brian, put on the smile I was used to, and pretend everything was normal. But nothing felt normal. Not anymore. It didn't help that Mr. Harris seemed to know exactly when I needed him, when I was at my weakest. The next few days were a blur of meetings, late-night work sessions, and increasingly charged moments between us. It wasn't just the office anymore. It was the way he looked at me across the conference table. The way his voice dropped when he addressed me directly. The way he always found an excuse to touch me. His presence was like a drug, and I was addicted. The power dynamic between us only made it more thrilling. Every time he walked into a room, everyone fell silent. His towering frame demanding respect, his voice cutting through the chatter. But with me he was different. He wasn't just the boss. He was something else. He was mine, even if I was fooling myself by thinking that. One evening, after a long day of endless meetings, we were the only ones left in the office again. Mr. Harris had come into my office under the guise of going over a few reports, something that could have waited but didn't. He always found an excuse to stay close. I hadn't seen Brian all day. He'd been working late on a project of his own, and the kids were at their grandparents' house. I was alone in the office. And so was he. "Carla," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've been thinking," he said. I looked up from my computer, meeting his gaze, trying to act composed, but my heart was already racing. I could feel the tension building, and I knew exactly where this was going. The question was, how far would I let it go? "What about?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent, though my voice betrayed me. It was shaky, uncertain. He moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty office, and I couldn't help but watch him. He was always so controlled, so composed, but now there was something raw about him, something desperate. "I don't think you know what you're doing to me," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. There was an intensity in his gaze, something dark and unyielding. "You've got me thinking about you all the time, and I don't think I can stop." The words hung in the air between us, thick with the weight of their meaning. It was dangerous, reckless even. But in that moment I didn't care. "Mr. Harris," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't. This is wrong." He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just moved closer, his presence overwhelming. "Is it, Carla? Is it wrong to want something that feels so right?" My breath caught in my throat. The way he said my name, like a command, a promise, made my pulse spike. I wasn't sure if I wanted to pull away or lean into him even more. The conflict within me was dizzying, but it was no match for the fire that was already building between us. Before I could respond, he reached for my hand, gently pulling it toward him. His touch was slow, deliberate, sending a shiver of anticipation through my body. He brushed his fingers along my palm, watching me closely. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt a flush spread across my face. "Carla," he said again, his voice rougher now, "I want you." The words weren't a question, they were a statement, and they left me speechless. I wanted him too. There was no denying that. But I also knew the consequences, the guilt, the risk. And yet, in that moment, the thrill of it, the danger of it, was what kept me rooted to the spot. "I can't, Mr. Harris. I have a husband," I finally said, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. He didn't pull away. Instead, he cupped my face, his thumb brushing over my cheek, his touch sending waves of heat through me. You don't have to choose, Carla. Not yet. Let me show you what it feels like to be desired. Let me show you what it feels like to be wanted by someone who can give you more than you've ever had. His words sent a shock through me, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. What was I doing? What was I even saying? But my body wasn't listening. Neither was my heart. He leaned down then, his lips hovering just above mine. I could feel his breath on my skin, and the anticipation between us was electric. The kiss came like a tidal wave. His lips were soft, urgent, and this time I didn't hesitate. I kissed him back with everything I had, throwing caution and every ounce of guilt out the window. It was so easy to give. Too easy. His hands roamed to my waist, pulling me closer. And I let him. I should have stopped it. I knew I should have. But every nerve in my body was alight, every part of me alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. When he broke the kiss, he didn't move far. Instead, he rested his forehead against mine, breathing heavily, as if he was struggling to keep control. You're mine now, he whispered, his voice rough with desire. I didn't answer. Couldn't. The words were lodged in my throat, too tangled up in the mess of my emotions. I was in too deep, and it felt too good to pull away. If you're loving the twists in this story, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. The game has only just begun, and trust me, it's about to get even more intense. We stood there for a moment, our bodies still pressed against each other, and I wondered if I had just sealed my fate. There was no going back now. I had crossed the line, and he had crossed it with me. And I didn't know if I was ready for what was to come. But I was sure of one thing, whatever it was, I wasn't stopping now. The next few days felt like a blur, a rush of moments that didn't seem to fully belong to me. My life, my marriage, my career, they were all spinning in different directions, each thread pulling me in a direction I didn't want to go, yet couldn't resist. I had made the choice to cross the line with Mr. Harris, and now there was no escaping it. When I woke up each morning, my heart was heavy with guilt. But it was also full of anticipation. I was tangled in a web of my own making, but in some twisted way, it felt exhilarating. The shame that gnawed at me when I thought about Brian, my husband, the man I had sworn my life to, was quickly overshadowed by the thrill of what was waiting for me at work. I couldn't get him out of my mind. Not for a second. His voice, his touch, the way he made me feel like I was the only woman in the room, consumed me. It was like I was living two separate lives, each one at odds with the other. At home, I was still the loving wife, playing the role that had once come so naturally. I made dinner, helped with the kids, smiled at Brian, and kissed him goodnight as if nothing had changed. But it had. And when I was at work, I was someone else entirely. With Mr. Harris, I was powerful, desired. Every glance he shot my way seemed to burn through me, leaving a trail of heat in its wake. Passion. The danger. It was intoxicating. But nothing could last forever. Could it? The tension between us kept building, growing until it felt like a pressure I couldn't escape. I had thought that maybe we could keep it casual, that it wouldn't go beyond stolen moments in the office, the briefest touches. But each time we crossed paths, it was like we were dancing closer to a cliff, one that I could feel beneath my feet but never quite reached. It was the day after our second kiss that everything started to unravel. I was at my desk, pretending to focus on a report, when the door to my office opened. In walked Mr. Harris. His usual confident stride came to a stop just before my desk. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the tension tightening in my chest. There was no mistaking it now. We had crossed the point of no return. "Carla," he said, his voice deep and steady, "I need to speak with you." I stood up, my pulse quickening, and nodded. I had no idea what he was going to say, but I was sure it would be nothing good. We had danced around this for days, pretending that everything was fine. But I could tell something was different today. The air between us felt thick, charged with something I couldn't put into words. "I'll meet you in the conference room in 5, he said. Without waiting for a response, He turned and walked away. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside me. My heart was pounding and my mind was racing. Was this it? Had he figured it out? Was he finally going to call things off? Or was this something more dangerous? Something I couldn't escape? I made my way to the conference room, my legs shaky, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. As I entered the room, I saw Mr. Harris standing by the large window, his back to me. The moment I closed the door, he turned, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said, his voice firm, though there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. A warning, maybe. I did as he asked, my heart lodged in my throat. The silence between us was thick, and I didn't know what to say, what to do. I had already let everything slip so far out of my control. I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it now. "Carla," he began, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "I've been thinking about us. About where this is going." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. I think it's time we stop pretending. What's been happening between us isn't just some fleeting thing. You and I both know that." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had tried to tell myself that we could keep it casual, that it was just an affair, just sex. But deep down I knew he was right. This was more than that. The way he looked at me, the way he touched me, it was as if we were bound by something stronger than lust, something more dangerous. But I wasn't ready for what he said next. "I want you, Carla. I want more than just these stolen moments. I want you to be with me all the way. No more secrets." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His words were like another punch, this time to my heart. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I was drowning in the weight of everything. My choices, my desires, my guilt. He took another step closer. "Say something," he urged, his voice softer now. But I couldn't. The words I wanted to say were a tangled mess of fear and longing. "Carla," he whispered, reaching for my hand again, his fingers brushing mine. The touch sent another wave of heat through my body, but it wasn't just passion that consumed me. It was the gravity of what he was asking for. Everything was about to change.